Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor for PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4. And of course what you are seeing here is the PC version. This is an action-adventure game developed by Monolith Productions and published by Warner Bros. Interactive in September of 2014 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One, and the last generation console versions came out a bit later, and finally the Mac and Linux versions even later after that. And it went on to become a pretty big success. I mean, it sold pretty well from what I've been able to find out, and it has received quite a bit of praise from a lot of people, both critic and player alike. And that was to the point where it actually won several awards that year, which is kind of interesting. And more interesting is the allegation of plagiarism by a member of the Assassin's Creed 2 development team, who basically claims that the movement system in particular is pretty much ripped from Assassin's Creed 2. And while I haven't heard about any legal proceedings or anything like that resulting from the plagiarism allegations, it is something to keep in mind. Although a slightly more interesting concern was the fact that most review outlets actually didn't receive review copies of this thing, and instead they gave them out to YouTubers with the stipulation that they had to describe the game in a very positive light, which is very shady when you get down to it. So with some shadiness going on behind the scenes, even though the game itself apparently to most people seems perfectly fine, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly what it is and whether or not it's deserving of the absolutely ludicrous amount of praise that it got. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's certainly got high production values, but it still ends up being fairly average for the current gen of consoles. You've got decent res textures, you got rather solid modeling and smooth animations for the most part, although on occasion you will run into a slight clipping error, but for the most part this game actually looks fairly good in that regard. But the only thing that actually stands out to me is the rain effects, and that's only because they are particularly nice rain effects. It's nothing we haven't seen before, it's just that in this game it is done particularly well. And while the color scheme in this game is fairly drab, at least it's not brown and gray and realistic. There are certainly more colors in this game than just brown and gray, although you do have to go looking for them at times, and it isn't really until you get to the second area of the game that you start seeing more vegetation in abundance. Until then, get used to a lot of dirt, ruins, and rocks, because that's pretty much all Mordor is. Luckily, you pretty much expect that going into this thing just because it is Shadow of Mordor, so it's going to take place basically in and around Mordor, so you know that the landscape's going to be pretty desolate to begin with. And at least they pretty much nailed the Lord of the Rings aesthetic with regards to visuals. This thing looks like it was ripped straight from the movies in some cases, and they did an absolutely fantastic job of making everything just look the part, at the very least. Now the sound design, on the other hand, well, depends on what they're doing. The music is pretty generic fantasy music, so it works okay, but it would have been nice if they had something a bit more interesting and a bit more unique. The sound effects also do their job rather well, it's just that none of them really stand out as being particularly great. And then there's the voice acting, whose quality is generally pretty solid, it's just that they don't really pronounce all that much correctly. I mean, to give you a prime example, going from a pretty early part in the game when you're finding one of the collectibles, Talion asks what certain markings are, and the Wraith responds with, "These are Ithilden," and the actual pronunciation is Ithildin. And that sort of thing pops up pretty regularly throughout the game, and it actually gets kind of annoying if you know anything about Lord of the Rings. But other than that, the voice actors do a pretty good job with what they're given, it's just that the script is often kind of cringe-inducing, but I'll get to that more in a moment. Because obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and since the dialogue is a pretty big part of the story, it makes sense to cover it after I've told you what the story is to begin with. It takes place between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you play as a guy named Talion, who is a ranger of Gondor. And after witnessing the officers of Sauron murder his wife and son and then kill him, he awakens to find that he has been merged with a wraith, and thus they are both denied death. So what does he do? Of course he goes seeking revenge, and what that basically entails is a kind of jumbled mess of a plot that ends up going all over the place in Mordor, completing various missions, encountering various characters, some of which have basically no reason to be in this game, like Gollum, for example. It's like they threw in Gollum just to have a recognizable character from the movies, but other than that, you're dealing with a bunch of characters who are pretty unremarkable for the most part. Talion himself is just kind of insufferable at times, and at other times he's mildly endearing. He fluctuates wildly. When he's being kind of witty and sarcastic, which is very, very rare actually, he's actually kind of endearing, but most of the time he's just angsty and obnoxious. And that's my favorite joke about Talion, is the one that Razorfist made about him in his review of Shadow of Mordor, where he played the clip where Talion says, "Tread lightly, my scars run very deep." And immediately after he says that, it starts playing Linkin Park's Crawling. And I'll readily admit I laughed at that way more than I probably should have, but who cares? The point is that Talion is a fairly unremarkable character for the most part, who just ends up complaining a lot and being angsty and rather angry most of the time. And the Wraith isn't much better. In fact, the more you learn about the Wraith, who is an elven spirit of some kind, and it's made more clear who it is the further you go into the game, the less it actually makes sense to have him as the Wraith. In fact, there's a lot of things in this plot that don't really make a whole lot of sense and are just kind of tangential to what you're really doing. I mean, sure, there's some kind of interesting missions where you go on a hunt and you end up being able to tame Caragors and Graugs, which are these various monsters that are found throughout the world, but you're taught how to ride Caragors much earlier in the game, and the Graugs are really only very situational. So why they saved those missions for so late in the game is actually kind of beyond me, but oh well. Of course, if you do manage to push your way through the plot, you're going to find that the ending is absolutely ridiculous, and the final few hours of the game are pretty lackluster when you get down to it. The main plot is nothing particularly good to begin with, but when you get to the latter parts of the game, it gets really bad really quickly. Until that point, you've got a pretty scatterbrained plot regarding things like recovering the memories of the Wraith, as well as the main plot of the story, which almost is forgotten at certain parts. And the further you go into it, the less you really give a crap, and the more you start actually going more into the gameplay to try to bring things up. Although whether or not you're going to like that is going to depend entirely on how you feel about the Batman Arkham games and the way they play. You see, this is basically a combination of, if you took the movement system from Assassin's Creed and combined it with some pretty general Arkham-style open-world gameplay, and then you threw in the Nemesis system, which I'll get to in a moment. What this means is your typical mission structure is going to mean that you're going to need to actually go to the mission start location, you're going to need to activate that, then you go to the next area that you need to go to for that particular mission, you complete an objective, which is usually something like stealth kill certain enemies, or just kill a certain number of enemies, or find certain things, and then you are going to do whatever else the mission requires of you, and your mission is over. Congratulations, you won. And the vast majority of your time is going to be spent either trying to go stealthy or just getting into the fray and actually taking advantage of the combat system. You see, the combat is very clearly based on the Batman Arkham series, which means that you have a button for punching things, or in this case slashing things or stabbing things with your sword, and then you have a button for countering. When a counter indicator appears above an enemy, you can press that button and then it will immediately counterattack. There's a button to stun your enemies, so you can unleash a particularly powerful flurry of attacks that will probably take them down instantly unless they're a boss fight or something like that. And as you build up your combos, you're going to have access to various abilities that you can use to change the way the fight is progressing. So, for example, there is a Wraith power that allows you to send out a shockwave. There is an ability that allows you to, when you get the meter going, you can just execute an enemy with a particularly gruesome animation, which is definitely appreciated. It's nice to have some actual finality to the fights in this, as opposed to the Batman series where you just kind of punch them around a bit and then they just kind of writhe around on the ground going, oh. Meanwhile, in this, you can do things like interrogate an orc and then stab him in the face all the way through with your longsword, and then pull the sword out and chop his head off for good measure. And those visceral animations actually go quite a ways to helping the combat system not just be ridiculously boring like it is in the Batman series. Although you do still get quite a bit of that where the combat just tends to drag on and on and on because enemies just keep respawning. But really the worst offender in that regard is the fact that enemies tend to bunch up a whole lot, so if you run into an area and you have to do a certain objective in order to make, say, a war chief pop up, then that war chief will pop up and then suddenly you'll have a huge horde of orcs just all of a sudden right there preventing you from being able to do much of anything. And that sort of thing gets incredibly irritating. And that's particularly so if, for example, you're fighting an orc captain or a war chief where they can have certain immunities that make it kind of difficult to deal with them if they've got a crowd of units surrounding them. And the Arkham-style combat really doesn't handle itself when you have groups as big as the number of orcs that will show up in this thing, where you can sometimes have 20, 30 plus dudes on screen at once trying to attack you, and it just makes it kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on half the time. Now, of course, this is something that alleviates over time as you gain access to more and more special abilities that will give you a distinct edge in combat, because early on in the game you basically have nothing and you are effectively worthless in melee, except for just attacking and countering, which is really easy to do. See, once you get past the melee in this thing, you end up finding that there is a bow mechanic that will slow down time when you whip it out, and if you get headshots with it, if they're charged shots anyway, the orc will probably be instantly dead from it unless they're a boss of some kind. Of course, you don't just have to turn your enemies into a pincushion with regards to using your bow. You can also use it to trigger various environmental things like barrels of grog, which explode when hit with an arrow, or things like Garuu cages, which will open up and unleash the Garuu upon an unsuspecting orc population, or Morgai fly nests, which will send enemies screaming off into the distance as they flee from the horrible angry bees. So you do have some tactical options available to you when you do get into a fight, and even before you get into a fight you have other options as well. Later in the game, if you manage to sneak into an enemy camp, you can poison their grog, and thus when they go to drink it, they'll actually end up dying, or if they survive it, then they'll suspect other orcs in the area of poisoning the grog, and then they'll go after them, which is always kind of amusing. Other than that, you can sneak up on orcs from behind or sneak into the bushes and draw them near in order to get a stealth kill, where you basically are just using your broken sword, which is effectively a dagger now, in order to just completely eviscerate them in a rather gruesome manner. Of course, the margin for error on all of these things is so wide that the combat and the stealth outright becomes trivial. This game is ludicrously easy for the most part, especially when you get later on in the game and you unlock the more advanced powers that allow you to do some crazy things like have basically infinite executions for a while. And really the only things that are going to pose any real threat to you are the boss fights and the large groups of enemies that will swarm you on occasion. But if you aren't fighting one of those two situations, you're going to find that the combat is ludicrously easy, and it doesn't really require much in the way of timing at all. The margin for error, like I said, is ridiculous, so you're going to have plenty of space to hit that counter button and avoid damage entirely. I have had my combo meter go up as high as the 70s before. It's actually pretty ridiculous when you think about it, and it is one of the biggest detriments of the game. It ends up becoming incredibly repetitive incredibly quickly just because there is so much combat and stealth in this thing, and neither of them are particularly well done. Certainly passable, although the enemy AI is incredibly stupid, so that renders the stealth ridiculously easy in addition to the combat, but at least it's passable. What isn't so much passable is the sheer amount of collectibles you'll run into this game. I mean, there are a ridiculous amount of various collectible items that you'll just find all over the place, various Ithildine that you can eventually piece together an image with, and there are a ton of herbs all over the place that will replenish your health instantly, as well as work toward these survival challenges that you'll find, which will give you points that you can then use to upgrade your character through one of the 2 upgrade panels. On the one hand, you have the one where you get points through, say, the side missions and such, And this allows you to get more passive things like upgrading the amount of health you can have or the amount of elf shot you get. The elf shot, of course, being the number of arrows you can shoot at things, such like that. While the other upgrade panel basically allows you to gain brand new abilities that are active instead of being passive things like the upgrades. So you'll find that you'll be able to suddenly be able to do a dash maneuver, or that you'll be able to just instantly mount the Caragors and forego the quick time event you need to do when you're trying to tame those things to begin with. And if you can't tell, that all of these abilities are going to make the game a hell of a lot easier the further in you get, so by the end of the game it is a complete joke in terms of difficulty, and it becomes mind-bogglingly repetitive. And speaking of repetitive, there's one thing that they throw into this that has cropped up in a lot of open world games lately, and it actually makes me angry. Towers. Those are your fast travel points, and you have to scale them and then hit a button at the top of them in order to unlock that fast travel, and that is going to also be your respawn point if you die in that vicinity. Can we just stop with the towers already? I was sick of it in the Assassin's Creed series, and then it migrated over into Far Cry, and now it's in pretty much every open world game, it seems. Honestly, who looks at Assassin's Creed and all the other Ubisoft games that do this and go, you know what we've got to include from those games in our game? Towers. Why? I don't know, because those games do it and obviously they're successful, so we have to include it in our game. And that's really what this feels like when you get down to it. It's basically an amalgamation of elements from Assassin's Creed and the Arkham games, resulting in something that feels extremely derivative while not really addressing any of those major faults that those other games had, making it a very unremarkable follow the leader kind of game. And then they throw in something that actually makes the game somewhat interesting. The Nemesis system. You see, when you really get down to it, this game can be summed up as Orc Killing Simulator 2014, and you would be extremely accurate in that regard because that's pretty much all you do the entire game. And the way they spice that up is by having your rank and file orcs supplemented by these captains and eventually the war chiefs at the top of the ladder, who are particularly powerful orcs that have certain special abilities, like they might be immune to ranged attacks, or they might be immune to stealth attacks, or they might get enraged at the sight of, say, ghouls, or they might be completely and utterly terrified of Morgai flies. Any number of these strengths and weaknesses you have to keep in mind and try to exploit in order to actually be able to defeat them. And one particularly amusing part of this is that you can actually take down an orc and they might survive it, and then they show up out of nowhere going, "Hey Ranger, I'm back and I'm badder than ever." And then you have to fight them again with some slightly different parameters this time around because they have upgraded. And this gives you kind of a personal investment in actually going out and fighting these orc captains, because they might come back and they remember what you did to them and you're like, oh yeah, that's what I did to that guy. Although sometimes it does get fairly amusing when you do things like stabbing them straight through the face and they somehow survive that later on down the line. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it is kind of amusing at least. But even in the event that you might actually get killed by one of these orcs, which is pretty rare actually, except for early on in the game, that orc then becomes your nemesis, and you can go hunt them down and take them out if you want. And it was actually fairly amusing because when I got to the end of the game, they actually make you fight your nemesis one last time before the final push. And in my particular case, the one that was my nemesis ended up being Huda Metalbeard. And for some reason he ditched his metal beard in favor of a metal plate on his head. But I seem to remember actually beheading him at one point, so how he came back to fight me at the end there is kind of beyond me. But I could just be misremembering. It was amusing regardless. But the thing is, it's more than just having a nemesis mechanic in there. They also have this element of Sauron's army, where all of the captains are interrelated in some way, where some will have feuds with others, and some will be vying for power, some are bodyguards for the war chiefs, and you can directly meddle in all of that and screw up their plans. If somebody is trying to get too powerful, you can go in and just demolish their plans for getting more powerful. If two guys get into a fight, you can actually go in and side with one or the other, or even try to take both of them out at once and just take advantage of the situation. It's really up to you how you meddle in the orc affairs, and that's actually the most interesting part of the game, particularly when you unlock the brand ability. Now, this isn't really unlocked until fairly late in the game, actually. But the idea is that you can sneak up on enemies and brand them, or you can just brand them from a distance and things like that, and they will then fight for you. Now, the normal orcs can be branded no problem, but the orc captains and the war chiefs, yes, the war chiefs can be branded as well, need to be whittled down first. So you need to actually get into a fight with them or something like that, and then brand them once their health meter has gone down enough that their icon turns green, and then you're free to brand them and make them your own. And then you can meddle even further in orc affairs by sending them off to fight certain other captains, or sending them off to just do things at your leisure, really. And that does get fairly amusing, at least for a while, because after a while, like pretty much everything else in this game, it does end up wearing out its welcome and become just kind of mundane. Simply because by that point the game is so incredibly easy, it is hard to actually get invested in anything. And that's ultimately the main problem with Shadow of Mordor. It is so incredibly easy that the extreme amount of repetition becomes outright boring pretty quickly. And it's only really the Nemesis system that's going to keep you going, because the plot is certainly not going to keep you going. And the core gameplay loop isn't really going to help you all that much in that regard either, simply because it is basically an amalgamation of Assassin's Creed and the Batman Arkham series, with the only real difference between them being that they actually have some fairly gruesome attack finishers, which certainly does help to spice things up a bit. But when you get down to it, the Batman Arkham series and the Assassin's Creed series both kind of wore themselves out already. And when you get to this, if you have played the Arkham series and if you've played the Assassin's Creed series, particularly if you've played a lot of them, then you're going to find that this is extremely derivative and not really in a very good way. Which of course means that unless you really, really like those games and for some baffling reason haven't gotten tired of them yet, then you'll probably be able to get a fair bit out of Shadow of Mordor. But then there's the question of whether or not this is a good piece of Lord of the Rings media, and for that it is downright awful. The sheer amount of liberties they take with the lore and outright nonsense that they throw in there is downright baffling and makes it extremely hard if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings to really be able to get into it. And ultimately that makes it hard to outright recommend. It's not an outright bad game by any stretch of the imagination, it's just not particularly good either. The ridiculous amount of praise it got is actually pretty baffling when you get down to it, because when you do get down to it, it's just a fairly average game. Maybe worth picking up if you find it on sale for a good price, and if you haven't played the Assassin's Creed games and the Arkham games, it's going to feel relatively fresh in that regard. But for the rest of us, it's a fairly average open-world action-adventure game in the style of a mixture of Assassin's Creed and Batman Arkham series, and we have played quite enough of those already. If all you really want to do is slaughter orcs by the hundreds, then this is your game, but for anybody else, there's probably better options out there. I give it a 3 out of 5. Again, it's not a bad game, it's just not a particularly good one either, and if you can pick it up on sale, then it might be worth it then, but that's really the only situation I can recommend it in. Thanks for watching.